The music industry is remembering the famed producer who's often been called the fifth Beatle. Martin died on Wednesday. He was 90 years old. Now, he was a huge influence, of course, on popular music. And speaking of popular music, do you remember this classic from the 80s? It's not a Beatles song, but we'll get to why we're running this in a moment. Do you remember this song that came out the year after? Well, that's because to talk about George Martin's life and legacy, I'm joined now by the two creative influences behind those songs. ABBA's Bjorn Ulvaeus, he joins me via Skype from Stockholm, and music producer Trevor Horn in Los Angeles. Thanks so much to both of you for joining us. Trevor, I want to start with you. You knew George Martin, right? What's going through your mind today, and what went through your mind when you learned of his death?
Well, I was very sad, but I was a big admirer of George's. I grew up with the Beatles, and his production on the Beatles was so good. I met him in 1983 when I got Producer of the Year, and he was so friendly and forthcoming and open. He was such a lovely guy. So the other thing that a lot of people forget about George is that he's the reason that record producers were paid in the end, because when he started out doing the Beatles, he didn't get a royalty, but he actually left EMI and insisted that he get a royalty and changed the whole music business for us. I wouldn't have a house if it wasn't for George.
Well, then you have a lot to thank him for, and we have a lot to thank him for because of his musical legacy. Bjorn, let's talk a little bit about how you've said that the Beatles, the fact that you realized when you were listening to Beatles songs that these were two songwriters, essentially, who revolutionized pop music, that gave you inspiration. Tell us more about that.
Well, I met George two times, and he was a very modest man. What an inspiration he must have been to so many artists. And I can imagine the creative flow of ideas that was going on in that studio with the Beatles. And as you said, the Beatles were actually the reason why my friend and co-writer Benny Anderson and I started writing songs. Because suddenly you had this group, they were writing their own stuff, and nobody had done that before.
Trevor, do you think, would the Beatles have existed in the way that they ended up revolutionizing the music, pop music, without George Martin, do you think?
Well, you know, George was a perfect fit for the Beatles because he'd done the Goons records, you know, I'm Walking Backwards for Christmas, and he'd done some really strange records. And if you think about it, back then the Goons would be like Monty Python would be nowadays. I don't think the Beatles could have got a better producer, because also George didn't have a huge ego, and he didn't have any sort of ulterior motives. And so, for instance, he tried to get them to record How Do You Do What You Do to Me, you know, the Jerry and the Pacemakers hit. And they recorded it, but, you know, they wouldn't release it, and they insisted on doing Please Please Me. And George went with it. He didn't have any sort of ulterior motive anyway, you know.
And how do you, your sound, Bjorn, and Trevor as well, of course, we're talking about the 70s and the 80s as well. But with the Beatles, it's the 60s. Explain to us, Bjorn, just how revolutionary that sound was at the time, and how much George Martin was the reason behind some of that.
Yeah, I think the reason was that they were so daring. They always took another step in some direction we never had anticipated. And that was so exciting with every album. And so that's what inspired us in ABBA later on, trying to do just that, to reinvent ourselves, to change from album to album. And they were the first ones to do that, I think.
They really did. By the way, Trevor, one of our producers asked you before the interview, which one is your favorite Beatles song? And you answered Day in the Life. I just want to run a little clip of that and then get you to answer another question.
Now they know how many holes it takes to fill the
quintessential Trevor George Martin, right? Super experimental, very instrumental. Talk to us about that particular sound.
Well, I think this is the one where John Lennon said he wanted the orchestra to sound like it was having an orgasm, and that's quite challenging. And George's whole way of doing it. I'll never listen to that song the
same way again. Yeah.
Sorry. Well, that was. And the way that George did it was so brilliant. But it wasn't just on that song, because on things like I Am the Walrus and Eleanor Rigby, he really defined pop music string writing. No one's ever come close to those two. And they're really held in high regard by most of my generation, you know?
And Bjorn, I mean, when you listen to today's music, what's your take on, I mean, there was real genius music production behind these classics, these indelible masterpieces from the Beatles. What do you think today's music has taken away in terms of legacy from that era, if anything?
A lot, you know, the songwriting, the writing of pop songs, it is virtually the same craft today as it was then when the Beatles started. And I wonder sometimes, what would they have done if they had, you know, today's technical help? It's because they only had an 8-track machine, I think, and maybe 16 towards the end. And that's what they had to make do with.
Bjorn, Trevor told us his favorite Beatles song was Day in the Life. Which is yours? Do you have one?
I have several. I'm a melody freak, so I love Penny Lane, but I also love Strawberry Fields.
Oh, well, those are Penny Lane, certainly George Martin, a big influence, Hard Day's Night as well. Yeah. So we have a great selection. I have to say, today's a sad day, but at the same time, it's a celebration, really, of the legacy of an amazing musical genius, George Martin. To both of you music legends as well, Trevor Horn and Bjorn Ulvaeus, thanks so much for joining us, for talking, joining us to talk about George Martin.